official welcome. Hi, I'm Darnell Johnson, for those who didn't catch my name earlier. I'm the coordinator with Right to the City in Boston. We're going to be joined today by a group out in Portland, Oregon, and also a group in Boston, Massachusetts.
Darnell, we're getting echoes. Maria
echoes.
May need to mute.
Okay, thank you. We're going to open up with a purpose of why we're having the training. Then we'll go into our presentations from both our visiting cities. Then we're going to open up into letting you know about the toolkit that Right to the City National has been putting together along with some partners from across the country. Then we'll open up for discussion, question and answer, and then we'll talk about next steps, things that are happening with Right to the City and ways that you can plug in and get involved. We've had a few more people join us. Please remember to use the chat box in the lower left corner for your name and or organization. All right. Tony, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to give us the purpose and welcome us into the training again.
Great. Thank you, Darnell. Good to be on with y'all. I'm Tony Romano with Homes for All, and just wanted to give y'all a little background to the campaign and talk about why we're having this series, Renter Nation training series, this entire year. So for those who aren't familiar, Homes for All is a national campaign coordinated by the Right to the City Alliance, and we have two core principles that guide everything we do. One is housing is a human right, and two, a deep understanding that housing and land justice are fundamentally about racial justice. We now have 50 community groups that are part of Homes for All, and they are in 30 cities and 20 states. And the main work we do is to implement translocal strategies where we link campaigns across cities that are similar in nature and try to have one common frame, brand, and strategy in moving these campaigns. So today you're going to hear about some translocal campaigns in the arena of just cause eviction, which are now moving in several cities. So why are we having these calls? One is we feel these calls are one way to address the moment we're in, which is where the housing crisis is intensifying, especially for working class and communities of color. We are experiencing in our communities across this country unprecedented levels of suffering and displacement, as y'all know and experience on the ground where you are. These calls are an effort to start building more connections with each other and foster dialogue amongst everyone who's committed to housing justice. These calls are also an attempt to help expand our organizing and share victories and successful work that's happening in various cities. And finally, we think there's a real opportunity we must seize upon now to build the housing justice movement and really start winning at a whole nother level. When we say seize the opportunity, what we're really talking about from Homes for All perspective is, one, to recognize and understand the historical moment we're in. Two, don't just do everything we've done in the past. Be bold and creative and be willing to experiment and be innovative. And next, we must be willing to evolve our current organizing model that can allow us to reach the thousands, in fact, millions of folks who are not organized and not engaged in a deep way in the housing justice movement. And finally, we must spread victories. When something's working, we must spread it to other cities like wildfire. So that's a little bit about the background. I'll turn it over to the first presenters.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. For our first presentation, we have Maria Cristina Blanco from City Life Vida Urbana, and then myself, Darnell Johnson. I'm the coordinator for Right to the City in Boston.
Still an echo.
Okay, so here's where we find out if the audio setup works. Sorry, I have to do it like this. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
we can, with no echo.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about the low-tech audio setup. So my name is Cristina Blanco. I'm a community organizer with City Life Vida Urbana, and I'm going to start off talking about this campaign for Just Cause for Eviction that we've been working on for the past 18 months in Boston. Welcome to our sharing of the Right to Remain and our Boston Just Cause for Eviction campaign. Our Boston Right to Remain Coalition is anchored by Right to the City Boston in partnership with the Boston Tenant Coalition. Right to the City Boston is an extension of National Right to the City. It's an alliance of people of color base building groups in Boston who formed alongside our national partners in 2007 to develop strategy, vision, and a collective effort to fight the root causes of displacement and gentrification in our local context. Through movement building and our strategy, we're aligning our organizing work. Our principles are the right to remain in a stable community, the right to economic justice and good jobs, the right to democratic participation, the right to the public good, and the right to a healthy environment. And our partner, the Boston Tenant Coalition, is a coalition of grassroots neighborhood tenant groups, community development corporations, and homeless and advocacy organizations. It promotes affordable housing in Boston. They organized to defend and expand the rights of tenants probably over a decade, maybe 2 decades ago. And they've continued to through many campaigns pushing the city, state, and federal government, as well as private industry, to address the needs of low-income tenants. And the Boston Tenant Coalition's core belief is that more affordable housing needs to be both permanent and targeted to Boston's low-income populations.
All right. The Right to Remain is a growing popular movement coming out of the work of Right to the City Boston, focusing on grassroots organizing and low-income people of color immigrant communities who are waging a long-term transformative fight against local displacement and gentrification. It's no secret that Boston has been named one of the most gentrifying and unequal cities in America. The foreclosure crisis hit us hard, stripping assets and ownership from housing and from working people, and handing it over to Wall Street banks and big corporate landlords. In recent years, our rental market, for decades actually, one of the most expensive in the country, went into overdrive. This has led to widespread displacement of market rate, Section 8, and small business tenants, on top of the homeowners that were continuing to be foreclosed. We are now in the midst of a luxury housing development boom. What we knew fighting to remain in our city would take everything that we got, and we would need everyone in the struggle. So we partnered with Boston Tenant Coalition and formed the Right to Remain Just Cause Eviction Coalition. The reason we did that was because gentrification was spreading and everyone was feeling the pressures. Together, we aimed to build Right to Remain and build on a mantra that resident rights and tenant protections needed to be increased, along with community control over land and development, and making speculators pay. We centered on winning policy gains that help stabilize communities while trying to help families remain in Boston's working class neighborhoods. Truly affordable housing needed to address accessibility, affordability, long-term stability, protections from displacement, community control, and planetary health that required us to build collective power and develop a unified core group of diverse grassroots leadership for both long-term and short-term transformative change. To reach our goals, we knew that we needed multiple voices and approaches to combat the displacement. We needed tenant rights were our first line of defense against displacement, and we needed multiple strategies working in a coordinated way to build power.
Okay, so back to me. Moving on, we identified the problem that the rapid rise of no-fault evictions in Boston is making our city unaffordable. And we've been hearing story after story of forced displacement by investors, so-called investors, and big real estate companies who are buying up property to clear out the residents and drastically raise the rent. And we feel that this is unfair. The way the law is completely unfair. We see that speculation is becoming a trend in Boston. So corporate and foreign investors are purchasing housing not based on the ability of the current occupants to pay, but rather on how high they imagine the rental market could go. And so this forces families and working people out of Boston, and that's why it's a core issue for our coalition, which includes groups that work on environmental justice and, as Darnell said, many different issues. But the fundamental thing is if your base is not able to afford to stay in the city and is being displaced by house flipping and rent increases, then you have nothing to work with, and so it's a common threat to all of us. And so you'll see here that we work with tenants. We have a youth leader, I think, pictured here, along with me, speaking on a local cable access TV show about her family's situation, living in a 6-family building that all received notices to quit a building clear out to flip the building, and have formed a tenant association and have been there fighting for over a year. And then moving to the next slide, to explain the background here. In Massachusetts, owners of privately owned non-subsidized housing can evict no fault. They don't have to give any reason for eviction. And under the current law, no distinction is made between landlords who are owner occupants and who rent out other units in a home they also live in, which is it used to be very common in Boston. We have a lot of multifamily housing, duplexes, triple deckers. So there's no distinction made between that type of a situation and a huge real estate company that might own hundreds or thousands of units. They all have access to this no-fault eviction procedure where they do not need to cite any reason at all to evict a tenant. So we felt that we need to change that. We need to implement a just cause for eviction policy that will promote community stability. It will keep people in their homes. It's a modest measure. It would put some limitations on how big real estate corporations and foreclosing banks are able to use our state's eviction laws. We want them to only be able to evict for just cause. If they're not an owner occupant, if they're a corporate owner holding the property as an investment, they should be required to have a just cause if they want to evict their tenants. And going to the next slide, we see one of our recent actions. Over the year 2015, our movement and our campaign has really grown and grown tremendously. Following an April City Council hearing on displacement that was attended by over 300 people, in October we again mobilized hundreds of tenants and homeowners to a citywide Right to Remain assembly. And there we declared the need for the City Council and the Mayor to stand with us to pass this just cause for eviction measure. After months of canvassing to collect petition signatures, showing community support, this citywide assembly was a chance to take advantage of the electoral cycle, get public pledges of support for the concept of just cause for eviction. We did get public pledges of support from 5 incumbent city councilors and 2 candidates who did go on to win and get on to the city council. Boston City Council has 13 members overall. And so the assembly, together with actions that member groups have been, direct actions that member groups have been doing, it created this sustained run of earned media over a period of weeks. And it, we broke out from, you can see there's the cable access TV show, there's the ethnic press, the neighborhood local press, but we broke out also into mainstream press outlets, including there was a 4-part public radio series on our WBUR's Radio Boston program that's very widely listened to by policymakers and so on. And it got to the point where eventually the mayor was publicly questioned on air on a mainstream radio program that has wide reach in eastern Massachusetts, questioned about just cause for eviction. There's so much buzz. Everyone's been talking about this. What's your position? So when they cornered him, he expressed tentative support, for the concept, which that was big. And our campaign's impact was actually felt even further when in, I think it was January or February, when he does his State of the City speech. Like I guess all mayors, do this annual speech. And so he felt the need to announce that he was creating a new Office of Housing Stability. And that definitely was using our language. Everything in his statement was listed from what we had been lobbying for around this Just Cause for Eviction campaign. So that's a point of pressure there. And our path to victory, it will require overcoming several hurdles, right? It's nice to have a name on an office door in City Hall, but we want real change, right? We are going to need to get this measure passed by the City Council. Then it has to be approved by the mayor, and then the petition process in the state legislature, most likely. So we've presented this proposed ordinance to the mayor. We're in dialogue with his administration. We're also in dialogue with several city councilors about possible sponsorship of the ordinance. Meanwhile, the opposition, of course, has counter-mobilized. They are lobbying the council. They are starting to put their message out in the press. There's an upcoming city council hearing next month on just cause for eviction as a concept, obviously reacting to our campaign demand. And so at this hearing, both pro and con sides will be invited to speak. So we're going to use this opportunity to show our strengths, our numbers. We hope that this will attract commitments from sponsors to file the ordinance and move forward, and show that the mayor's administration that just a symbolic recognition of our campaign is we're not going to stop at that, and we hope to attract his support as well. So,
with that, we hope that you help us win in 2016. You can sign a petition to show your support. You can join us on March 14th at 4 o'clock if you happen to be in the Boston area. You can also tell your story of displacement through our Tumblr page as Right to Remain Tumblr.
With all our partners in the National Homes for All movement, our right to remain.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for joining me in that presentation.
Yes.
We're going to now move on to the presentation. From all the way to the other side of the country.
It's hard to hear you, Darnell.
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
All right. Yay. We're going to turn it over to our friends from the other side of the country, from Portland, Oregon. We have Katrina, Holland, and Justin Buri from Community Alliance of Tenants. Take it away.
Thank you, Darnell. This is Justin Buri, Executive Director of the Community Alliance of Tenants. CAT is a statewide grassroots tenant-led organization. We have about 2,000 members throughout the state. Our motto is to organize and educate and empower tenants to demand and obtain safe and stable affordable rental housing in Oregon. We do that through our tenant education program, through our organizing, as well as our housing justice project, in which we advocate at the local, state, and federal levels. Just Cause has been on the top of our members' priority list for the 20 years since we've been around. And, you know, this has been a moment that we've been building to for over 10 years. I'll let Katrina jump in.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Katrina. I serve as Deputy Director for the Community Alliance of Tenants. I'm just going to, since we have
we're getting an echo.
Time,
Katrina, we're getting echo.
How about now? Still an echo?
Nope.
Okay, cool. So since we have a limited amount of time, we're just going to jump right in, go a little bit into context. So similar to Boston, Portland has become increasingly popular, but it can't house everybody who wants to live here. It's been dubbed one of the top, not the top city in America for the fastest rising rents and the highest level of gentrification. It's also considered to be one of the most popular in-migration destinations for America. According to a report that was put out by Metro Regional Government, it's estimated that we could see an increase of about 1.7 million people in the next 20 years. And so the shortage of housing has led to an unprecedented rate of rent increases and no-cause evictions as landlords are taking advantage of revenue increases simply because they can. At the same time, Portland is home to a lot of renters. About 48% of the city of Portland is comprised of renters of varying income levels. And of course, just like the city of Boston and around the country, vulnerable and historically marginalized populations are overrepresented in this group. But they struggle the most to find the most affordable place to live in Portland. So because of this, you know, CAT has a deep history of organizing and advocacy. In addition to our education program, as Justin said, we have a base of about 2,000 members in Oregon, and we've been organizing specifically around no-cause evictions and building-based organizing to help tenants win repairs and assert their rights as renters for about 9 years in the Safe Housing Project. And during that organizing period, we discovered that evictions are the number one barrier to getting repairs. And based off of the way that the market has played out over the last couple of years, we saw a significant uptick of no-cause evictions that really reached a fever pitch in 2015, which we've then dubbed the Summer of Evictions. And of course, you know, as Justin stated, we always knew that they were a problem, but it became exponentially worse with a hot rental market, extremely low vacancy rates, and high rents as people continue to migrate in with higher incomes.
And so we've been looking at the issue of just cause evictions for quite some time, and we see it as a very intersectional issue in terms of the impact and use of no-cause evictions. Overall, there's a huge imbalance of power between the landlords and tenant within the Oregon landlord-tenant law, and a main source of that imbalance is the threat or the use of no-cause evictions, and what that leads to is tenants that are unwilling to ask for repairs or otherwise stand up for their rights simply because they know that landlords can use that no-cause eviction in a retaliatory way, and it's very difficult to prove. And so it's not only the evictions that cause displacement and send tenants into a tailspin when they have to scramble for housing, but the very threat of a no-cause evictions that landlords can use explicitly can prohibit tenants from enforcing the rights that they have under the landlord-tenant law, especially when it comes to repairs. And so we find more and more tenants living in substandard housing, unhealthy housing, getting sick from their housing because they don't want to rock the boat, and that leads to the disinvestment that landlords can use in order to flip the building later on because they don't have to keep up the maintenance of the building and make those repairs. And so a brief timeline of how we got here. And so, we serve the renters' rights hotline, and evictions is one of the biggest complaints that we receive on the hotline. We've been organizing under the Safe Housing Project for over eight years, and the Safe Housing Project, in order to gain repairs, tenants are unwilling to ask for repairs unless it's in a group, in a organized setting, because they don't want to be singled out in terms of retaliation. In 2012 and 2013, we were looking into the data around just cause, and we were pulling FED filings, the evictions filing from the courthouse. We had partnerships with the local information referral telephone service, and we did some surveying, and we found some preliminary research around the use and impact of no-cause evictions, but weren't able to move forward with the campaign at that time. And then last year, we had our renter state of emergency campaign that launched in September 2015, where we called for a 1-year moratorium on no-cause evictions and a 1-year notice period for rent increases. And when we came out with that renter state of emergency, that really changed the narrative around evictions and rent increases, not only in Portland, but throughout the state. And we had wins and opportunities at both levels that really, although we weren't able to get full just cause evictions, it really served as a great launching pad in order for us to implement this plan and implement this campaign in 2016 and 2017. And so one of the main pieces of how we're building a just cause campaign is through community-based participatory research. We just won some funding from a local funder. And knowing that the tenants are the best, the impacted tenants are the best people to know what questions we need to ask when it comes to further research and data gathering. And we want to empower and build the capacity of those very tenants to be able to look at the methodologies of what research needs to be done and how we communicate and with tenants in order to get their stories and their data within themselves in order to come up with significant, or I would say verifiable data to show what kind of impact this has. And so we're in the very beginning stages of working with our tenant leaders and partners in order to develop what that research looks like and come out with a report in 2016 or early 2017. And the biggest issue is that there's no public recording or registry when a tenant receives a no-cause evictions, and they normally move out. And so there isn't, it's very difficult for us to communicate to policymakers and partners just how widespread this is. And so without that, we need to gather the data from tenants themselves in order to demonstrate not only the health impacts, but the economic impacts of displacement. And so that research will inform political and organizing strategies to win just cause evictions in 2016 and 2017. And we're using that as a way to build the coalition. So a community-based participatory research has various partners as well as tenant leaders in order to look at the question of what needs to be, what questions need to be asked, and how do we how do we communicate with tenants, and how do we empower them to be leading the data collection and the analysis. And through that, build their leadership through organizing and leadership development trainings based on what we hear from the tenants as we're collecting those stories and that data. And next. And one thing that has come out of that is there's new energy from local partners and around these types of data gathering. We're working with the city when they're doing their fair housing analysis of impediments research and asking questions about evictions, as well as the county to do a report that's similar to the displacement or development without displacement report that came out of Oakland 2 years back. And the outcome of that will be to look at the existing just cause ordinances that are throughout the country, like Seattle and San Francisco, that list different possible no fault evictions that can be used as long as they're used with relocation assistance when the tenant is not at fault. Are you still muted?
All right, here we go. So talk a little bit about
hearing an echo.
I'm out. Go.
There we go. Okay. So to talk a little bit about the targets, because of the level of activity that we've seen in 2015 and 2016, we really noticed that it can be accomplished at either level of government with different levels of capacity required from the Community Alliance of Tenants and from our base. With the state, for the most part, it's a strong inside game, what we've learned from the state legislative session of 2016, and also requires a lot of coalition building outside of Portland, because Portland is considered the anomaly city in the state of Oregon. And of course, the landlord lobby is strong. There's lots of landlords in the state legislature, and there's a lot of ideologies about renting and home ownership that clash with what it is that we're trying to accomplish with just cause evictions. At the city level, we definitely, of course, have to have a strong inside game, but with a stronger outside pressure game, because Portland doesn't like to be embarrassed when it comes to different levels of leadership and different methods of leadership in trying to accomplish housing justice and housing equality for all. Talking a little bit about the tactics, in terms of movement building, renter state of emergency has resonated very well, both with the public, with city officials, with state officials, and so we're kind of deciding whether or not we're going to roll it into just cause eviction CVPR or continue to use the branding of renter state of emergency as we move forward with just cause in 2016, 2017. And also as a result, there have been other tenant groups that have emerged, like as you see Marie Allen Claire from Tenants Priced Out, Portland Tenants United led by Margot Black. These ad hoc groups that have emerged that are really willing to be out on the front lines and help to build that outside pressure. There's also mainstream funders that are beginning to pay attention and directing resources to this movement, and that's both in the city of Portland, outside in Oregon, and even across the country. And so there's really been a significant movement that's been built as a result of this. As far as the legal strategy, one of the things we're also considering is because of the disparate impact that we've discovered in 2012, 2013, and of course now we may consider a fair housing litigation strategy, because they're seniors, people with disabilities, people of color are the most affected when it comes to no-cause evictions. They receive the most, and they're the hardest hit. So even if it's just to get case law on the books, that's something that we're considering. Right. It looks like you guys are muted. There's one more slide, but it looked like it didn't make it in, so.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. So do we want to move to the next slide, or I can briefly just talk about those last points?
Yeah, go ahead.
Talk about the last point.
Okay. Sure. So in terms of communication, one of the things that we have found to be very effective in the city of Portland and around the state is our primary message revolves around no-cause evictions being the epicenter of this disaster-like housing crisis. Homelessness has gone up in crazy numbers. I mean, just to give you a sample, the African Americans in the city of Portland, homelessness over a period of 2 years has increased 48%. It's literally unprecedented and unacceptable. And so we've identified, kind of like the city of Boston, no-cause evictions as being the epicenter of this disaster that we've seen. We've also seen a significant uptick in the level of conversation among electoral politics, and that's for mayoral elections are coming up, and frontrunners have taken on the housing crisis as one of the number one issues to address. One of the candidates has put forth a tenant bill of rights that outlines just cause protections as a policy priority for him. And so we're waiting for the other candidate to see how they're going to play off each other. They have yet to outline their support, but the point is it's part of the conversation, and it's driving electoral politics. And then, of course, with resource generation, as we've continued to build our base in organizing and advocacy, we utilized a crowdfunding campaign to raise over $11,000 in renter state of emergency. And, of course, as we talked about earlier with mainstream funders, we'll continue to do that and combine those resources together. Where we sit currently, we've raised just over $100,000 to be utilized over the next 2 or 3 years for this Just Cause campaign. And simultaneously, Kat will be turning 20 years old, so that's a nice little sweet spot that we can use. So that's a brief overview of Just Cause CBPR. Sure, Justin is going to add a few more.
And on the last point, in terms of building a coalition and campaign, with all of this energy and recently, we've a lot of unexpected allies have emerged, and people that we haven't had strong relationships in the past, but that are helping us build towards a Just Cause Eviction campaign in 2016. Local labor unions like SEIU and AFSCME have, and even the Portland Public Schools have recently reached out to us and asked how they can support these efforts. And remarkably enough, statewide housing authorities, because the level of evictions, they're unable to actually get their vouchers utilized. And so even without building a ground game of outreach to build a coalition, because of the change in the conversation, we've seen these allies emerge that we haven't worked with as closely in the past, and really seeing that some of them as helping us, especially at the statewide level, move a lot of these issues.
So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. We'll have this available, right, I believe, to send out to other folks, right?
Yes.
Yes,
okay,
we will.
Cool. Great. Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome, and thank you so much. Thank you to our team for presenting on Just Cause Eviction. I want to remind folks that in the lower left-hand corner of your screen is the chat box. We're going to be using that to capture your questions and comments. You can also put links in there if you have information that you'd like to share or specific questions or contacts that you'd like to make. I'm going to turn this over to Tony, who's going to take us through the Just Cause Eviction Toolkit that was put together by collaborators from across the country. Go ahead, Tony.
Great. So before we hop into the discussion, we just wanted to let y'all know that from previous calls, there's been requests of providing information to help people learn from victories and successful campaigns. So we've made an effort in each of our training series to provide a toolkit to share some basic information our different cities have and successful models that have been used. So I will share the link with you today for the Just Cause Eviction Toolkit. Last month we shared the Rent Control Toolkit. And like I said, the main reasons we're doing this is, one, we do want to support initiating new Just Cause Eviction campaigns in different cities. When something works, we want to make sure there's an ability to spread, and instead of us all making the same mistakes, let us learn from others and replicate what's working. Also, we think this is part of our plan to promote real solutions to gentrification and rising rents, and really challenge what we consider at Homes for All to be a myth that gentrification is inevitable. We have to live with it and make the best of it. So we really do think there's other ways to develop that aren't merely profit-driven, that actually there can be development without displacement, and Just Cause Eviction is one of those tools that helps to stabilize communities. So the link, I'll share the link with you. These are some of the things that are contained in the toolkit, from facts about Just Cause to some of the history and analysis to model ordinances, like from Berkeley and then the one that Boston's working on. Berkeley, California is considered one of the best Just Cause ordinances in the country. So we've definitely shared that with you. And then sample materials that Boston and other groups are using, talking points for city council meetings, social media tools, sample letters, petitions, etc., that you may pull some information from and adapt to your own fight. So here is the link, and we will send the link out tomorrow. We're recording this with a recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint and other information. So if you can't write it down now, you will get this link tomorrow. But please take a look at the Just Cause Eviction Toolkit. It is an evolving document that people add to and improve constantly. So if you also have insight or ideas or additional information, please get that to us at info@homesforall.org.
All right. Thank you so much, Tony. Again, just a reminder, don't forget to use the text box at the lower left-hand corner of your screen to give us some questions. We have a first question here coming in. I can't tell who it's from, but either group, can you please talk about how just cause evictions, how you're using it as an intersectional issue and approach to your movement building in your different cities? Anyone want to go?
Okay, I hope I'm not talking over somebody, but this reminded me, hearing the presentation from the other group over in Oregon. You know, there's so many similarities and there's a lot of interesting differences. But some of the similarities I was reflecting on that we didn't get a chance to mention during our presentation is we've been able to use this issue of just cause for eviction to actually continue to build on the work that some of our groups, including the group that I work for, City Life Vida Urbana, is a member of the Right to the City Boston. We do a lot of work on foreclosure and with small homeowners, and so a big point of intersection is that the just cause for eviction policy that we're proposing would protect homeowners who lose their home to a bank from being arbitrarily evicted post-foreclosure. That would give them better negotiating leverage to try to get a modification from the bank if they know that they're not going to be able to get this person out. They're going to have to rent to them as a tenant and try to sell the building occupied after foreclosure. So that continues to bring together working class homeowners and working class tenants. And in the past, we feel that in previous efforts around like 10 years ago, there were major campaigns in Boston to bring back some tenant protections after we lost our rent control laws that we used to have in 1994. We lost them. And so about 10 years after that, which is, about 10 years ago now, there were efforts to bring back more tenant protections. And the other side, the real estate industry was so successful at exploiting this division between tenants and homeowners, but then the foreclosure crisis swept through our city and really laid bare that reality that we have so much more in common with each other as working class people. So we actually developed a kind of a popular education skit that's called The Chain Reaction of Displacement, and it has characters in it that it involves kind of like a series of exchanges at doors between landlords and tenants, between a foreclosing bank and a foreclosed homeowner, between a corporate landlord and their tenant, a Section 8 tenant and their landlord, a commercial landlord, and so on. You can find that on City Life's our YouTube page, and I think we're official CLVU on YouTube. And it's people get really into it. We use that skit at our assembly, and that's something that shows the intersections, the commonalities between our merchants in our community, our small businesses, between Section 8 tenants and market rate tenants. That's another big division that we that we find that we need to try to overcome. So these are some of the groups that we try to draw together in our campaign. Thanks, and I'll try to post that link.
I'll follow up with some on that. We are building this movement called Right to Remain, which really envelops a series of other stabilization tactics and tools within it, things that also help promote the increase in revenues and funds for affordable housing to the city, challenges the land and development and control powers within our redevelopment authority here in Boston, and also looks at how we're raising the minimum wage and connecting wages to the issues of stability and stabilization in Boston. And so the way that we're moving this campaign is very important, as also the outcome, which is we're bringing the community together and trying to address stabilization in the whole totality of a person's life, knowing that housing is the human right that we're focusing on, and that we're trying to purposely slow down the displacement that's happening in our neighborhoods.
Go for it.
So some of the intersectional issues that we see, as I mentioned before, especially is around education. We have a district in a low-income area of the city that is busting at the seams, and children are having to move multiple times in a school year or are homeless because of evictions. And so certainly a lot of education advocates have understood evictions and displacement as a barrier to advancing children's education, and also mentioned public health, not only tenants living in substandard housing because of evictions, but the stress impacts of displacement can have on a family and their health is huge, and we've been working with a number of partners and researchers around that. Of course, it's a major driver of homelessness, and the mayor declared a homelessness state of emergency, and there's tents popping up everywhere, and evictions are entering that narrative in terms of why people become homeless. We are in the midst of a campaign with the Anti-Displacement Coalition around the comprehensive plan, and that's Portland's 20-year plan around transportation, economic development, land use zoning, and tenant protections and evictions are certainly a big part of that conversation. And that leads to economic mobility. You know, as tenants are evicted and they have to drain their resources in order to land on their feet, or they become homeless, you know, they lose the ability to advance, to save up, to plan for the future, to put a down payment on a house, or save up for their kids' college education. So all of these issues we see, and as well as racial justice, which I'll let Katrina talk about a little bit.
Yeah, of course, one of the biggest issues that we see, of course, is racial justice. As we talked about, the research that we found, or the findings that we gathered from 2012-2013, discovered that African Americans and Native Americans are the ones that suffer the most when it comes to no-cause evictions, both in getting them and suffering the impacts of them. So, of course, thinking about that fair housing strategy that we talked about a little bit earlier, in the next year we're possibly thinking of filing against a landlord who evicted a building that was comprised mostly of African Americans, and so racial justice is definitely at the center of what we're doing. The partners that we're working with are very culturally specific in terms of building the base around folks who are going to drive this campaign, understanding that racial justice and housing justice coincide together, and that racial justice underlies everything that has to do with housing justice, because when it comes to specific groups, marginalized groups, they suffer the most. And so we are making a very specific effort in making sure that they are leading the effort against just cause evictions, or against no cause evictions with just cause evictions.
Mm-hmm. I guess this next question is a question for both groups. How did you or do you come to the balance of understanding of providing legal support that brings cases before the judges with longer-term strategies to shift the policy? So the question is, how did you balance the need to provide legal services that bring cases before judges versus long-term strategies to shift power and policy? And by the way, the presenters aren't the only ones that can answer. Other folks can chime in too. So hit *6 to unmute yourself if you'd like to join the conversation.
Okay. So just really quickly, this is Katrina from the Community Alliance of Tenants. In the city of Portland, that has been one of our biggest barriers, is utilizing legal strategies to accomplish some sort of headway when it comes to just cause evictions, because the only out that we have right now according to landlord-tenant law in the state of Oregon, is if it's used in a retaliatory manner. But even that is flawed in that the tenants, the burden of proof lies on the tenants to be able to find the resources to get a lawyer to represent them, to be able to gather the documentation needed to prove that there was retaliation, so which means that you have to gather documents of how you submitted a repair request to a landlord, or how you tried to assert your rights against illegal entry, or assert your rights against a fee that wasn't supposed to be imposed, and as a result of that, the landlord decided to evict you, or because you didn't park right, which is something that we have right now. And so legal strategies have been, though we think it's definitely one of the things that we should rely on because it's the most powerful, it's something that we're severely limited in doing in the state of Oregon, because the only out that we have is retaliation right now. That's effective. In addition to that, there are, in the legal community in Oregon, especially in the city of Portland, folks are, and when I say folks, I'm speaking specifically about attorneys, there's a lot of hesitation about how we can use legal strategies because it doesn't generate a whole lot of money. And so it's, we do what we can in terms of referral when folks tell us that they asked for a repair and they were given a no-cause eviction within a certain amount of time, or fairly soon after that, we definitely refer them to the Fair Housing Council of Oregon to see, not the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, Legal Aid Services of Oregon to see if there's any outs that they can prove based off of the documentation that the tenant has, and we go from there. It's a really tough battle here in Oregon anyway.
I can say here in Boston, so not the whole Right to Remain Coalition, but City Life Vida Urbana is one member, Chinese Progressive Association is another member, that are part of a partnership. We're very fortunate to have law schools here in Boston, as well as a legal services agency, law schools that have, progressive professors and traditions where they do have a partnership with us. So our organization happens to handle that in such a way that we have a weekly open membership meeting for anyone facing displacement, whether through foreclosure or eviction, that's staffed in a sense that the volunteer attorneys, student attorneys, legal services attorneys come to these meetings and have individual consults with people, while also part of the meeting is dedicated to planning actions, joint campaigns, collective bargaining efforts, forming tenant associations. And I think that one of those student attorneys might be on the call here if you have anything more to say, but Stanford Fraser might be on the call, and he actually was kind of the main author of our proposed ordinance, the version that we've been floating around City Hall. So he's seen both things. He's worked on cases and won cases, of no-fault evictions against landlords, and he's also worked on this legislation to try to change at the policy level.
Okay, while we're seeing if others want to join the conversation, we have a lot of questions on the chat box that talks about direct action. Both groups, I think, use direct action for various different things. There's a way to use direct action for inside pressure and a way to use direct action for outside pressure. Could folks on the call share some good direct actions on either side that did pressure inside and pressure outside that you could share?
Justin's jumping on. He's got to go through some. There we go.
So for direct actions, we're still at the beginning stages of our Just Cause campaign. So we're looking at what types of direct actions would be most effective, especially because there's still a little bit of a strategy when it comes to both state and local levels. For the Renter State of Emergency campaign that really launched this back in September, we had a press conference in Raleigh that brought out a couple hundred folks where we made our demands around the moratorium on no-cause evictions. And then that was quickly followed up by the Housing Commissioner's proposal for a 90-day notice notice for no-cause evictions and rent increases. And when there was the hearing, we used that as an opportunity to pack City Hall, and we had over 20 tenants that provided testimonies about their experience with no-cause evictions. And so, we tried to keep the narrative as high level as we could, especially because we felt like that proposal wasn't strong enough when we needed more. And so now that it's transitioning more into a full-fledged Just Cause campaign, we're looking at what, based on our coalition and partnerships, what will be the best direct actions for both the city and local levels.
Yeah, we have direct actions that involve sometimes targeting, sometimes government targets specifically, but sometimes just built around people's cases. So people that come into our meetings and have eviction cases and displacement cases when they're fighting through the legal system, often. Well, that's why we call it the sword and shield partnership, right? Just, one by themselves without the other is not necessarily going to be as effective. And so often you can't get a fair solution through, that's why we're trying to change the law, right? So we try to develop our members' cases into, things where we have standouts at the courthouse to reach the other people that are going through evictions on the days that they'll have court dates. And escalating up from that, then we'll have vigils at people's homes and try to, and do speak outs and try to get the press and make the neighbors aware. And then we'll be able to sometimes use that example of a particularly, atrocious case. We'll be able to maybe have like a whole neighborhood, a big march. And then up from there, if we can't get justice through the legal system, to try to stave off an unfair eviction and publicize the need for systemic change, right? We'll sometimes plan actions protesting evictions, like eviction blockades. We'll just have an ultimatum. We're going to chain ourselves to the door, and you're going to have to, have the police drag us away if you want to get this person out. And that, is probably the most escalated in terms of our direct action tactics. And then there's our mass mobilizations like the assembly, like the City Hall hearings. I think we've done civil disobedience actually in front of the courthouse once to protest no-fault evictions related to foreclosure and the Fannie and Freddie's, refusal to follow our state laws about that. So that was where we were trying to block the doors of the actual courthouse. So there's a huge variety of tactics that can be used.
Yeah. Also to mention, as we were talking earlier, there have been several groups that have emerged in Portland. One of them was Portland Tenants United. There was a case in Portland where a 73-year-old man was given a no-cause eviction. He had lived there for 30-something years, I believe, and didn't want to move. Granted, it was some substandard housing conditions, but he had been there for so long, and he was just trying to get the repairs that he needed. And Portland Tenants United definitely took action, and we provided support as much as we could, but they literally plan to go to the property management company and protest there and stand in to say, no, you can't kick this man out, and threatened to do that, threatened them with significant public exposure for what they were doing to this man. And as a result, I can't remember exactly what happened, but the man was able to either gain more time or stay in his home, in which he decided that he just was going to move. But it was very stressful for him. But the direct action of folks coming together to literally go to the property and demand that the property management company not kick this man out was very successful. The variety of groups, variety of tactics. We definitely, Community Alliance of Tenants, has a role to play, and so does others. And we all work together collaboratively.
All right.
Darnell,
Looking
can
to
I
the next.
chime in with
Yeah.
a question based on the article that Nick just shared from Maine?
Yes. Go ahead.
So Nick from Maine just shared an article by the Press Herald about a company that's planning to renovate a whole apartment complex and force out tenants, many of whom are low income or mentally disabled, into a very high price market. That's what the header of the article says. And the question from Nick is just curiosity about some ideas about how folks, presenters or in your organizations, might respond to a situation like that.
I'm sorry, you were asking Portland specifically?
No, I think
Either
it's
of you.
open to anyone. Yeah.
Okay.
And it would definitely be good to hear from Boston about your experience dealing with corporate landlords and forming corporate landlord-tenant unions.
Yeah, sorry for the time delay here. So, yeah, I was trying to look over that article and see what the situation is. Sometimes in that kind of a situation, it ends up that it's has to do with expiring use. Like if the building was subsidized and then with like project-based Section 8 or whatever, and then the landlord wants to go market and clear out the building. But sometimes the rents have just de facto been lower rents that have been affordable to working people. And so that certainly sounds like a big challenge, but a big opportunity. Folks with that level of disabilities, it's very sympathetic, in the way that it's talked about in the press article, right? And obviously it's attracted the attention of, it seems like, they quoted a lot of city officials that are scrambling around to try to, do something about this. It can be, but organizing a tenant association is, it requires, a lot of leadership and development and wherewithal. And so, when folks have significant disabilities, wow, that does strike me as a huge challenge. But certainly, if you can organize a tenant union and get people to say, no, this isn't fair and I'm not going to leave, and then, however many units are in the building, well, then the landlord is going to have to go through eviction processes for each of these units. That's a significant expense. And so connecting, the tenants with legal help to fight evictions, at the same time that you organize them to, be on the same page and not accept move-out agreements, can be very successful. A case like this, because of who they're targeting, that's something that if anyone from Boston Tenant Coalition is on the call, they might have experience in some of our neighborhoods like the Fenway or whatever, where we're building clearouts, we're fighting building clearouts too. Sometimes of, elderly folks are another demographic that's, very sympathetic and often very, they have the motivation to, to try to fight these increases in clearouts. But at the same time, there can be real limitations in terms of the kind of actions they can do, working with them and so on.
In Portland, so it was actually the occurrence of these mass displacements, entire buildings being cleared out for renovations or for wanting to replace the tenants with higher paying tenants, that launched the renter state of emergency itself. And so there was a apartment building in North Portland that received mass evictions. I think folks had been there for a really long time. I think one family had been there for maybe 10 or 12 years after moving to Portland, and so we contacted the tenants themselves. We definitely, because it is a crisis situation, it's really delicate balance, because when folks receive mass evictions, while we realize that there's definitely potential for using it as a platform to speak out against the injustice of no-cause evictions, there's also some very risky actions in doing that can be pretty traumatizing to the tenants. And so one of the things that we prioritize whenever we are providing support to a group is making sure that the tenants are taken care of first, both with support, if that means, getting them a support group to talk to, or providing support ourselves, B, training the tenants on the different risks and benefits associated with them sharing their stories through various platforms that we're providing at the time, and C, helping them with trying to find housing afterward, because providing support through a crisis situation is just as important as utilizing the situation itself as a way to outline the injustices of no-cause evictions. And so, I won't say their names specifically because I'd like to protect their privacy, but the family that did decide to speak out and be essentially the face of Renter State of Emergency when we launched it, we worked with them for about a week and a half to 2 weeks prior to launching it to craft their story, to give them the support that they needed, to try and help them find housing, connect them with lawyers if necessary, if there was any retaliatory issues that were associated with it. And then, we stood with them up there as they were giving their speech at the press conference, and we provided support to them as there was, of course, a media flurry that was just going after them day after day after day, trying to get their stories. And so, we did what we could to support them through that, and as a result have asked them and other families who have decided to use their instances as a way to demonstrate the injustices of no-cause evictions, to prepare other tenants for when they do go through situations like this and they do want to use their stories, to prepare them adequately to understand the trauma that's associated with it, to understand the emotional distress that could be associated with it, but also channeling that energy in a manner that's going to be successful in communicating our message.
And this is Tony, Organizing Director with Right to the City. I just want to piggyback on what Maria and Katrina said. One thing, every city is different, but Nick, one thing I would say, a lesson we've learned across cities across this country that are facing mass evictions is we've seen the greatest power tenants have is when they are still in the building and still united. Once they are evicted and leave that building, it's qualitatively much more difficult to fight. So on the front end, like Katrina said, getting support and connecting with the residents and having them connect with each other is critical, and letting them know their rights to stay. Because often what we see is the landlord will use any dirty tactics, harassment, etc. So they need to know their rights, and they need to know they have a right to stand up and not move if they don't want to. So where we have been able to keep a critical mass of tenants in the building, then we have had a much better chance to win the ultimate goal of them staying and preventing the mass displacement and preventing the conversion, the gentrification to luxury housing. The dream goal would be that they even take over ownership, collective ownership. But so I can't stress, timing is critical. You don't want to wait till everyone's evicted, and you want to start getting to them immediately. And the telling of the stories is critical. The landlord usually does everything underhanded, harasses folks, they get kicked out, no one knows about it. If you can bring this to light and the residents will tell their stories and stand up, that's critical. And this brings up key alliances with other movements. For example, where we have undocumented folks in a building, having a strong relationship with the immigrant rights movement, where just because you're undocumented doesn't mean you have to take crap from everybody. means you still have rights. So, we find ways that undocumented fighters, formerly incarcerated fighters, still have a right to speak out, and we'll defend them against retaliation. So I just want to stress those are some key things that we've learned that work across the country. We will also say right now, given the severity of the housing crisis, there is a level of sensitivity amongst politicians, amongst the media, to the crisis. So we're getting more attention than we usually have gotten in the past.
And just to stress, I know we're trying to get to everything before we end, but people aren't just fighting for the bigger. Well, that's a terrible way to put it. People are fighting for change at all levels here, and people can actually, right, if you can get to people and you have the legal partnerships built up in the community organizing capacity, direct actions, press strategy, people can win. I mean, they can stop displacement. We have seen that happen in Boston. Many places have seen that happen. So when people are speaking out, they're speaking out both to make change at a bigger level and also to change the course of their case. So that's just something to keep in mind, that it is benefits and risks, right? But when people stick together, yeah, they can back the landlords down, the investors down.
Both you and Tony just talked on one of the questions that came up a couple of times on what would be your advice to new groups of residents or organizations that are thinking about launching a new Just Cause campaign in their city. And what led into that was how you start organizing in the place of where folks live, and building out a network of neighbor to neighbor, street to street, and then move to a place of enacting policies that can help cover folks in the city. Are there some other advices that folks would like to add as to a group or residents or an organization that's thinking about just cause eviction? I'll go ahead and merge it with the next question that came up around, if just cause eviction is to pass, are there elements that can be added around rent control that folks fear is what the landlord's true approach is in pushing people out, is to raise the rent?
Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is Matt from Greater Boston Legal Services. So at least in Boston, the way the ordinance was written up, we were trying to address that by saying that rent increases over a certain percentage would trigger a mediation session, so that landlords would have to sit down with tenants to work something out potentially before they could bring them to court. So I think that's sort of the way to approach that. I know that some jurisdictions that have just cause don't have that requirement. So I know New Hampshire, for example, has a just cause protection, but you could still raise the rent, and that's considered sufficient cause if a tenant doesn't accept a rent increase. And my understanding is, for whatever reason, owners haven't really abused that very much, but New Hampshire is obviously a different rental market from Boston or a lot of other cities. So, but I do think here, having that kind of provision that protects, that makes it clear that a tenant's refusal to accept a large rent increase falls within kind of the protections of the just cause ordinance or statute is probably key.
Yeah, and this is Justin from Oregon. There is a statewide ban in Oregon on any form of rent control at the local level, and so certainly that is a huge barrier in terms of enacting a robust just cause eviction ordinance at the city or even the state level. Seeing that as a potential loophole for landlords to be able to get around the just cause eviction protections by just spiking the rents to by doubling the rent or tripling the rent or what have you. And we are open to suggestions from around the country and are looking into legal strategies to help close that loophole. But I would say that once we get a just cause evictions protections, the next step is to look at that rent control, the prohibition, and try to address it wholly.
This is Matt
actually
again.
Part of our.
Do you want to go, Maria Cristina?
Go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, so we have a similar setup in Massachusetts where rent control was banned in 1994. So at least the strategy for this ordinance was, like I mentioned, having a rent increase of a certain size trigger a procedural step that landlords have to go through, recognizing that it's not going to stop landlords at the end of the day from getting a tenant out if the tenant doesn't accept a rent increase, but it at least creates one more step and enables tenant groups to intercede at that stage. So in addition to having to go to mediation, a landlord would have to send a copy of whatever notice to quit to the city, and those notices would be publicly available or at least made available to tenant groups so that there would be an opportunity for organizers and others to get involved.
Yeah, and so in that sense, I think that whoever last spoke before Matt, our theory of change is kind of similar, I think, in that, as I mentioned, there was this whole background that we didn't get into in our presentation where the Boston Tenant Coalition, one of our Right to Remain anchor groups, formed over 10 years ago, probably in the very early 2000s or the late 90s, in response to losing rent control and tried to win back protections. The opposition was very powerful and was able to counter mobilize, and we didn't really win very much significant at all to speak of, right? So having had that experience of organizing, mobilizing, and not winning back rent control, or any of the compromise positions that we kind of stepped back to, we looked at, well, if our goal is to get new rent regulations and so on, right, we have to start somewhere. We have to have a victory that we can then build on. So that's our theory of change this time. I guess we'll see whether that bears out.
Gregory submitted a question that ties into some of this around what landlords are doing to try to push people out. We just talked about raising the rent, but now what happens when a landlord agrees to lease provisions such as maintenance repairs, but then refuses to fulfill those maintenance repairs and evicts the person at the end of their lease?
I think in the legal world they call that counterclaims, and that's a defense to eviction. So working with tenants proactively, I guess, can help identify some of those defenses that they may be able to use. If one of the lawyers wants to jump in, or if we need to kind of move on to another topic.
And I would just add, this is Tony again with Right to the City. I think the key concept or understanding we need to have as a tenant in that situation is not to think about that situation as an individual. Right? Now, there certainly are individual routes you can take. You can file legal papers, etc. But it's very important that at least you have a dual track, because your greatest power is as a collective. So, and most likely other tenants are experiencing the same or other injustices. So I think it's important that people develop a collective consciousness that, hey, as a tenant, let me connect with my other tenants. If we work together, one, we'll have more power to get my problem solved, and we'll be able to fix the conditions likely in the entire place. So I think when tenants start to understand that their greatest power is through their collectivity and not just through filing something legally, then it opens a whole nother realm of what can happen.
Yes, and
I could add.
Sometimes your fellow tenants are I'll just say this, and I'll allow the lawyer to jump in. Sometimes your fellow tenants that you can form a common interest group in are like, other people in your same building because, it's owned by the same landlord. Or sometimes you might have a lot of scattered small properties that are all, if you trace it, if you have folks that can do some research and trace it back to who is the corporate owner, you find that, you may have to go canvass from one neighborhood to another, but all these people belong to the same landlord. Or there can be other points of commonality that, you're all Section 8 tenants, even if you have different landlords, but you can, form a Section 8 Tenants United. We have that in our city. So there are many bases to form a tenant union.
All right. Thank you so much to everyone. I want to remind folks that if you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to email us or add it to the chat box before we get off the call here. We're going to get ready to wrap up here, so I want to make sure I give Tony a chance to talk to us about next steps and what you can expect from Right to the City and delivering some information to you. Thanks again to those over in Oregon. Thanks to you, Maria Cristina, here in Boston.
Thank you.
Tony, take us away.
Good. So just to wrap up, because this is not the end, it's just the beginning. So immediate next steps that we at Homes for All are going to take is tomorrow you will receive a recording of this webinar. You will receive the actual PowerPoint that you're seeing, and you'll receive, again, the link to the Just Cause Eviction Toolkit. You'll also receive contact information for each presenter and myself and other people at Right to the City and Homes for All. So those are immediate next steps that we commit to. The other next steps we feel are critical is that this dialogue and this reaching out and connecting with each other needs to continue. And we really believe that because so many of us are impacted, if we unite and when we unite, there is no question about what we can win. And there's no question that one day we will have a right to housing. So it's just a question that most of us are not united and organized. So we encourage the dialogue to continue. We welcome folks to join Homes for All and join one of the working committees where you can work directly with other cities that are in similar situations. You can join us at homesforall.org. You can sign the pledge and then work with us and be part of the crew. The other thing to know is every month we will host one of these online trainings. The next online training is on community control. How do we win it? And what's the role of community land trust in winning community control? And you should know at Homes for All, we have multiple strategies. Our groups, many of them are fighting for immediate citywide ordinances that will improve the situation of hundreds of thousands of people, like rent control and just cause eviction. And we do know that when we win rent control and just cause, those two ordinances together take us a long way to prevent displacement and for us to be safe and secure in our neighborhoods and to make sure that we shape and benefit from any development that happens. But at the other end, we understand when millions of people won rent control in the 70s, we have seen that slowly be destroyed because we know the landlord and real estate lobby, as you heard from the presenters, are extremely powerful. They don't go away when we win something. They continue to fight every day to take it away. So what our groups have been moving towards is also looking at a model where we have permanent community control, where landlords, speculators cannot touch us in any way. Community land trust, where the community and the residents collectively own the land, it's proven that they have a lot of stability and security. And one of the best examples, and you're going to hear a lot more of this on March 30th, but our folks in Boston at City Life, while it looked like a war zone during the foreclosure crisis in terms of the number of evictions and foreclosures, there was one island in the middle of Boston which was an oasis, which had hardly any evictions or any foreclosures, and that's called Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And the reason for that stark difference is very simple. That land is collectively owned and controlled by the residents. So the speculators, the banks, the sharks could not touch that land. So please join us on March 30th. It's a critical call, and we believe both of these tracks, fighting for renters' rights that have shorter-term impacts and then ultimately winning permanent community control, both of them need to be fought for simultaneously. So I want to thank everyone for participating. We look forward to working with y'all. We've been inspired on this call to hear about other cities and what's happening and the fights that are going on there. So thank you again, and we'll get you information tomorrow, and we'll look forward to continuing to work with y'all and build a movement. We want to leave y'all with one of our slogans, which is we never want to be under any illusion that if we get together, we automatically win. We understand the forces we're up against are very powerful, and what we want them to do is not in their interest, because their interest is to maximize profit. So our slogan is, we win what we are strong enough to take. So let us get together and become stronger and build a more powerful housing justice movement that can secure a right to housing for all of us. Have a good day. We look forward to working with y'all down the road.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.